Hi, my name is Olga Leandris, and in this video, I will go over the planning part of the greenhouse gas impact assessment of agricultural policies. This video is part of a series of videos that give an overview of the ICAT agriculture methodology, and I encourage you to watch the others that provide an overview of the entire methodology, as well as those that cover different parts of the assessment process. So the assessment process is set up in a modular way so that people can easily find most pertinent sections. It is composed of three parts. Part one is the planning for the assessment. This is what will be covered in this video. Part two focuses on selecting and describing the policy, and it provides guidance on how you would go about doing that. And the third part of the methodology is the assessment of GHG impacts. Each assessment chapter focuses on a particular emission source and shows how to estimate GHG emissions associated with the policy activities. That is covered in a different video as well. The agriculture methodology also provides supporting materials, such as templates, a toolkit with additional resources and case studies to help the assessment team kind of understand how the assessment methodology is applied and get more resources to support it. So we're going to spend a little bit of time going over the first part of the assessment process, which is planning for the assessment. This is covered in chapter 2 of the guide. The planning stage of the assessment covers getting familiar with the fundamentals, preparing for stakeholder engagement, as well as reaching consensus on assessment objectives. Furthermore, the chapter covers methodological considerations, so IPCC methodology tiers, data needs for the assessment, as well as how to set baselines. It also talks about how to approach tracking progress and potentially preparing for additional technical review as part of the assessment. So if the assessment team is familiar with the information covered in this planning part, they may decide to skip ahead to selecting and describing the policy for assessment, which is covered in another video. So starting with the essentials, the guide goes into some concepts and definitions that are helpful in the planning phase of the assessment. And this includes agriculture definitions, so which activities are covered, reporting frameworks, as well as the assessment principles. So the agricultural activities covered in the guide include a subset of all the different types of agricultural activities that may result in changes in emissions or removals of greenhouse gases. We, in this guide, look at livestock production and manure management and look at the emissions of methane and nitrous oxide associated with that. We also look at fertilizer application, in particular synthetic and fertilizer and nitrous oxide emissions related to those activities. We also look at how carbon stocks and emissions change as a result of land management on cropland. And last but not least, we cover activities and emissions associated with rice cultivation, so nitrous oxide and methane emissions for rice. So when conducting policy impact assessment, it's important to keep in mind international reporting requirements under the Paris Agreement. Under the Paris Agreement and the Enhanced Transparency Framework, all countries shall submit biannual transparency reports that include information about their mitigation measures. They do this for each sector to achieve nationally determined contribution targets. So in the guide, we identify parts of the assessment that are also pieces of information that are required for international reporting. And hopefully that will make then preparing those reports easier for the country if they have already completed the policy assessment through this process. So as an example, these pieces of information are collected as part of the assessment. And those are going to be also the ones that are reported under the Enhanced Transparency Framework. These include some really basic elements of the policy, such as the name, objective, description, instrument type, as well as go into more detail about its implementation status, when it started, which gases are affected, who is implementing the policy, and of course, the estimated GHG emission reduction. So after having gone through the assessment, you will have these key elements needed for reporting under the enhanced transparency framework as well. And the guide provides templates to help summarize the assessment results and identifies these particular components that then can plug into the international reports. The planning phase also includes reviewing the assessment principles. These underpin and guide the impact assessment process, especially where guidance provides flexibility or requires expert judgment. These include transparency, accuracy, completeness, consistency, relevance, and comparability. You will find more information about these in the guide, and it's always a good step to review them and remind yourself of them when you're doing the assessment. The next component of the planning phase is preparing for stakeholder engagement. Stakeholder engagement is important because it builds trust. It creates a mechanism for raising issues before the implementation begins. It raises awareness about the policy activities and climate change impacts more broadly. It also can enhance credibility, transparency, and access to finance for implementing the policy. Typical stakeholder groups in the agriculture sector include farmers and ranchers, include producer associations, communities, indigenous peoples, or marginalized groups that are affected by or involved in policy implementation, as well as research institutions and private sector. It may be organizations or businesses that provide equipment or sell fertilizer. So engaging stakeholders is marked as a key recommendation in the guide, and you will see this checkmark symbol next to it, that section in the guide. You will also see it throughout the guide to mark other steps that we recommend strongly that are implemented as part of the assessment. In the guide, we also provide additional resources that can help with the stakeholder engagement process in particular, such as the ICAT Stakeholder Participation Guide, but there are additional tools that are referenced throughout the guide, and you will see them labeled with the symbol of the little toolbox here. And then also in the guide, you will see this symbol that actually designates steps within the assessment that call for stakeholder engagement. And so it'll be easy to spot those stakeholder engagement opportunities and make sure that they're included in the planning process. Another key recommendation in the planning phase is to determine what are the objectives for the assessment. These may vary depending on when the assessment is conducted. So if you're doing ex-ante assessment, which means before policy implementation, the objectives are likely to be more forward-looking and focus on things like informing the design of the policy, informing goal setting, projecting and understanding what kind of reductions can be achieved, as well as understanding the technical capacity needed to implement the policy. Now, if you're doing an ex post assessment, which is during the policy implementation period or after the policy implementation period has already completed, the objectives tend to be more retrospective. So you're looking at evaluating effectiveness of the policy, most likely, or tracking progress towards achieving the targets identified in the policy. And you may be doing this assessment to help refine implementation and policy design. So as implementation continues, it's more effective and improved. So the next part of The planning is to consider data and methodology to use in estimating greenhouse gas emissions. So emission calculations in their simplest form are a product of activity data and appropriate emission factors. So it's really important to identify what activity data you would need and gather that data with sufficient level of accuracy and completeness so that you can conduct the assessment. Here's an example of data types that one would need to assess policies associated with manure management. These include kind of understanding what kind of manure storage system is in place and how it will be affected, what excretion, what kind of manure is being produced and how much of it. And that in turn is kind of driven by what the livestock is consuming. So you need information about the feed of livestock as well as emission factors to then do the calculations. These are just some examples, and really which data parameters are necessary will depend on the policy at hand. But the guide also provides points the assessment team to available databases that can help obtain activity data needed for the assessment if there are data gaps in local data. Another methodological consideration is regarding baselines, and establishing a baseline is a critical component of conducting this assessment. You need a reference scenario or a baseline scenario against which impacts will be estimated. So depending on the availability and the quality of historical and forecast data, different approaches can be used for determining the baseline scenario. And here's just some examples of what these might look like. You may decide to apply a constant baseline, which is the simplest form and rests on the assumption that no changes are expected in kind of base level consumption patterns or production patterns. You may also apply a simple trend line baseline or an advanced trend baseline. A simple one is basically what it sounds. It's usually kind of assumes a linear relationship that's consistent based on some historical information, whereas an advanced trend baseline usually involves some kind of modeling and more resource intensive, but can probably better capture kind of a more realistic scenario involving numerous interrelated factors that may lead to changes in production, agricultural production activities. The guide also points to some additional resources for constructing baseline if the team needs so. So while planning the assessment, the next step is to consider the key performance indicators to track policy implementation and performance. A key performance indicator is a metric that kind of tells you about the state or the level of policy performance, whether policy is on track and is reaching the targets that it set out. KPIs can track policy activities, intermediate outcomes, as well as final impacts such as GHG emissions. And ultimately the KPI selection will depend on the policy and what it's trying to achieve. But here we just show some examples such as budget allocations, farmers attending training workshops, fertilizer application rates, emission intensity, and then for non-GHG impacts, you can also look at productivity levels and things like that. There are more examples of different KPIs in the guide that can be helpful in determining what kind of KPIs to select for your policy assessment. The last step in the planning phase is considering the technical review of the assessment results. A review process can inform future improvements in the impact assessment and can also increase the transparency and confidence of the assessment results. Some specific objectives of the technical review may include, improvements in policy design and continual kind of learning of how to better estimate impact. It may help demonstrate results to donor agencies or financial institutions, increase transparency and confidence of the results, as well as help compare results of this policy to others. And this can be conducted by a commercial or nonprofit organization chosen based on their technical expertise, experience, and low potential conflict of interest. So while this is mentioned in the planning phase, actually technical review is conducted after the assessment is complete, but it's helpful to do this and plan for this in advance before you begin the assessment. And there are also additional resources that can help make decisions about whether technical review is a good step to take. In particular, ICAT Technical Review Guide provides additional information about technical review process. It can help inform that step further. So this concludes the overview of the planning stage of the assessment. And if you're interested in learning more, all the materials can be found on the ICAT website. If you go to the toolbar at the top and click on Toolbox and select Assessment Guides, you will end up on the landing page with all the different assessment guides that ICAT offers. And if you select Agriculture, this will take you to the page with all the materials, the assessment guide, the templates that I'd mentioned, as well as some the executive summary and some technical supplement materials that can help with the assessment, which is covered in another video. With that, I would like to acknowledge the team that was involved in producing this guide, my co-authors, and the team that provided activity data for the assessment examples, reviewers and advisors, and the design and layout teams. Thank you for listening. And if you have any more information, don't hesitate to contact us at GHGMI or ICAT for more information about how to apply the ICAT agriculture methodology. Thank you.